In 1970, Chevrolet built an engine so powerful, so absurdly overpowered, that it scared the living daylights out of everyone who drove it. 450 horsepower. From the factory, in a car you could walk into any dealership and buy with cash. This is the story of the Chevy 454 LS6 and how it became the most powerful production engine America ever built, before the government killed it. Along the way, we're going to see corporate warfare, backroom deals, a muscle car arms race that spiraled completely out of control, and an ending that still makes gearheads cry into their beer. So let's begin. But first, how did we get here? How did American car companies end up in a horsepower war so insane that they were putting race engines in family sedans? To understand the LS6, you have to understand the 60s. And the 60s, well, the 60s were nuts. See, after World War II, America had something no other country on earth possessed: endless cheap gasoline. The Middle East was pumping oil like there was no tomorrow, and most of it was flowing straight into American gas tanks. Nobody thought about fuel economy. Nobody cared. Gas was cheaper than milk in some places, and that created an environment where car companies could do basically whatever they wanted. What they wanted, it turns out, was to go fast. The muscle car era didn't start with a grand plan. It started with a loophole. In 1963, General Motors had a corporate policy banning engines larger than 330 cubic inches in intermediate-sized cars. The idea was safety. Or at least, that's what they told the insurance companies. Big engines in small cars meant trouble. Everyone knew that. But John DeLorean, who was running Pontiac's performance division at the time, had other ideas. He figured out that if he made the big engine an option, rather than standard equipment, he could technically get around the ban. The brass wouldn't notice. Or if they did notice, they wouldn't care, because the cars would sell. He was right. The 1964 Pontiac GTO was born. 325 horsepower in a mid-size body. It was supposed to sell maybe 5,000 units. It sold 32,000 in its first year. The muscle car era had begun. Now here's the thing about car companies. They're like teenagers. The moment one of them does something cool, everyone else has to do it bigger. Ford saw what Pontiac was doing and responded with the Mustang. Chevrolet countered with the Camaro. Dodge threw in the Charger. Plymouth built the Roadrunner. Every year the engines got bigger, the horsepower numbers climbed higher, and the cars got faster. By 1969, it was absolute chaos. You could walk into a dealership and buy a car with 400 horsepower. 400. That's supercar territory today, and back then you could get it in something called a Chevelle, which was basically a family sedan with a death wish. But Chevrolet wanted more. They always wanted more. The big block Chevy engine had been around since 1965, starting at 396 cubic inches. It grew to 427 cubic inches. And then, for 1970, Chevrolet did something that still makes engineers shake their heads. They bored it out to 454 cubic inches, nearly 7.5 liters of displacement, in a production car that you could buy. The base version of the 454, called the LS6, made 360 horsepower. That was the sensible option, the one for people who wanted a fast car but also wanted to keep their license. And then there was the LS6. I want you to understand what Chevrolet did with the LS6, because it borders on irresponsible. They took that 454 cubic inch block and turned it into something that belonged on a racetrack, not a public road. The compression ratio was 11.25 to 1. That's race fuel territory. They fitted a massive Holley 4-barrel carburetor, 780 cubic feet per minute of airflow. The camshaft was aggressive, with specs that would make a modern engineer nervous. Forged aluminum pistons, 4-bolt main bearing caps, heavy-duty connecting rods. This wasn't an engine, it was a statement. The official horsepower rating was 450 at 5,600 RPM. Torque was 500 pound-feet at 3,600 RPM. And I should mention, those numbers were lies. Not lies in the bad way, lies in the American car company way. See, back then, horsepower was measured at the flywheel with no accessories attached. No alternator, no power steering pump, no air conditioning compressor, nothing but the engine itself running on a dyno with open headers. The numbers you saw in the brochure were optimistic at best, fantasy at worst. But the LS6 was different. The LS6 was actually underrated. Chevrolet knew what they had. They knew that if they published the real numbers, the insurance companies would lose their minds. So they kept it at 450. Nice round number. Sounds impressive, but not insane. The real output? Dyno tests on stock LS6 engines regularly showed 500 horsepower or more. Some independent tests found over 550 at the crank. Think about that for a second. A car you could buy from a Chevrolet dealer with a warranty was putting out more power than some dedicated race cars. And they put this monster in the Chevy SS 4x4. The car weighed about 3,800 pounds with a driver. Do the math on the power-to-weight ratio and you get something terrifying. Magazine tests from the era tell the story. Motor Trend ran an LS6 Chevelle down the quarter mile in 13:44 seconds at 108 miles per hour. Car and driver got 13.3 seconds. Hot Rod Magazine, with a few modifications, cracked into the 12-second range, 12 seconds, in 1970, with a car that had air conditioning and a radio. The acceleration wasn't the scary part. Well, it was scary. But what really got people's attention was the way the car felt. Drivers described it as violent. The engine didn't rev up smoothly. It exploded. Plant your foot, and the back tires would spin in first, second, and sometimes third gear. The whole car would squat, the nose would rise, and you'd feel that big block trying to twist itself out of the engine bay. This was not a car for beginners. This was not a car for most people. This was a car for people who had either very good reflexes or very poor judgment. And yet, you could buy one for about $4,000 in 1970, which is around $30,000 today. That's less than a base model pickup truck costs now, and you got the most powerful engine in American automotive history. Chevrolet sold 4,475 LS6 Chevelle in 1970. That might not sound like many, but remember, this was an engine that required premium fuel, got maybe 8 miles per gallon if you were gentle, and would destroy its rear tires in a single afternoon of spirited driving. 4,000 buyers was 4,000 people with either too much money or too little sense. Probably both. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, here's where the story takes a turn. Because everything I just told you, all that power, all that glory, all that beautiful, irresponsible engineering, it was about to end. And it wasn't going to end slowly. By 1970, the party was already winding down. You just couldn't see it yet. The warning signs had been building for years. Ralph Nader's book, Unsafe at Any Speed, had come out in 1965, and it turned car safety into a political issue. Insurance companies were raising rates on muscle cars to absurd levels. A young driver trying to insure an LS6 Chevelle might pay more in insurance than the car payment itself. That alone killed sales for a lot of buyers. But the real threat wasn't insurance. It wasn't even safety advocates. The real threat was the air. Los Angeles had been choking on smog for decades. By the late 60s, you could literally see the brown haze hanging over the city most days. People were getting sick. The environmental movement was gaining momentum, and the federal government decided to do something about it. The Clean Air Act of 1970 changed everything. Not right away. The regulations would phase in over several years, but the writing was on the wall. Cars would need to meet new emissions standards, and meeting those standards with a high-compression, high-performance engine was essentially impossible with the technology of the era. See, high-compression ratios, like the 11 1/4 to 1 in the LS6, required leaded gasoline. Lead was an additive that prevented engine knock in high-compression engines. But lead was also poison, and the new regulations were phasing it out. Catalytic converters were coming, and catalytic converters couldn't survive with leaded fuel. The entire technological foundation of the muscle car era was being dismantled. Chevrolet saw what was coming. For 1971, they detuned the LS6. Compression dropped to 9-1. Horsepower fell to 425, still impressive, but a shadow of what the engine had been. The LS6 Chevelle was still fast, but it wasn't the same animal. The edge was gone. And then, for 1972, the LS6 disappeared entirely. Just like that. One year it was the most powerful engine you could buy. The next year it didn't exist. Chevrolet didn't even make a big announcement. The engine just wasn't in the catalog anymore. If you wanted a 454, you could get the LS5, now rated at a pathetic 270 horsepower under the new SAE net rating system. 270, from an engine that had made 500 2 years earlier. The muscle car era was over, not with a bang, but with a corporate memo and a federal regulation. Now, I should be fair here. The horsepower numbers from 1972 onward aren't directly comparable to the earlier figures. The industry switched from gross horsepower to net horsepower, which measured output with all accessories attached and the engine installed in the car. The same engine would show a lower number under the new system. So some of the drop was just accounting. But not all of it, not even close. The 1972 454 really was weaker, lower compression, milder camshaft, restrictive emissions equipment. The engine that had been a tire-shredding monster in 1970 was now basically a truck motor. Smooth, reliable, capable of moving heavy loads, but not fast, not exciting, not special. By the mid-70s, the most powerful engine you could buy in a Chevrolet was making maybe 200 horsepower. The entire industry had collapsed. Gas prices had skyrocketed after the 1973 oil embargo. Insurance rates were still brutal. Emissions regulations kept getting stricter. The muscle car was dead. And the LS6? The LS6 became a legend. Here's what I find fascinating about the way car culture works. The LS6 was only available for 2 model years, 1970 and 1971. It was sold in relatively small numbers. Most of the people who bought them didn't baby them. They drove them hard, raced them on weekends, burned through clutches and tires and eventually engines. A lot of LS6 cars ended up wrecked or worn out or converted to something else when the original drivetrain gave up, which means that today a genuine LS6 Chevelle is worth a small fortune. We're talking 6 figures, easily. A numbers-matching, documented LS6 car in excellent condition can sell for $200,000 or more at auction. $300,000 isn't unheard of for the right example. These were $4,000 cars in 1970. That's a return on investment that would make a hedge fund manager weep with joy. But here's the thing, and I think this is important. The value isn't just about rarity. There are plenty of rare cars that nobody cares about. The LS6 is valuable because it represents something that will never exist again. Think about what would happen if a car company tried to build an LS6 today. An engine with no emissions controls, running on leaded fuel, getting 8 miles per gallon, with so much power it was genuinely dangerous in untrained hands. It's not possible. It couldn't be certified for sale, it couldn't be insured, it probably couldn't even be marketed without a legal team having a collective heart attack. The LS6 was a product of a specific moment in history. A moment when gasoline was cheap, regulations were loose, insurance companies hadn't figured out how to price risk properly, and car companies were in an arms race with no adult supervision. That moment lasted maybe 10 years, and then it was gone forever. Every year, the survivors get a little more valuable, a little more collectible, a little more mythologized. People who weren't even born in 1970 now save up to buy these cars, to own a piece of an era they'll never experience firsthand. It's automotive archaeology. We're preserving artifacts from a civilization that no longer exists? And what of the people who built it? What happened to the engineers who created this monster? Zora Arkus Duntov, the legendary engineer behind the Corvette, had pushed for big block engines throughout the 60s. He wanted Chevrolet to dominate racing, and he understood that winning races sold cars. By 1970, he was fighting a losing battle against corporate bean counters, who saw performance as a liability rather than an asset. He retired in 1975, frustrated but proud of what he'd accomplished. John DeLorean, the man who started the whole muscle car craze with the GTO, left General Motors in 1973. He'd risen to the highest levels of the company, but grew disillusioned with the corporate culture. He eventually started his own car company, which produced exactly one model, the stainless steel DeLorean that became famous in Back to the Future. The company went bankrupt in 1982. Dick Kynath, who was chief engineer for Chevrolet during the LS6 era, stayed with GM until retirement. He gave interviews decades later, talking about how much fun those years had been, how the engineers had basically been given free rein to build the fastest, most powerful cars they could imagine. He remembered the LS6 fondly but without illusions. "We knew it couldn't last," he said in one interview. "We just didn't know it would end so fast." The car buyers themselves, the 4,400 people who plunked down their money for an LS6 Chevelle in 1970, scattered to the winds. Some kept their cars, most didn't. The ones who held on, who stored their Chevelles in garages and kept them running through the lean years of the 80s and 90s, those are the people sitting on six-figure assets today. The rest sold them for a few $1,000s, moved on with their lives, and probably try not to think about what their cars would be worth now. There's a lesson in there somewhere about recognizing what's special while you still have it. But honestly, how could anyone have known? In 1975, muscle cars looked like relics of a dumber time. The future was economy cars and safety features, and maybe someday electric vehicles. Nobody thought we'd spend the next 50 years romanticizing tire smoke and 8 miles per gallon. But we did. We do. The LS6 was built for just 2 years. It sold in just small numbers. It was too powerful for its chassis, too thirsty for its era, too raw and uncompromising for a world that was learning to compromise. And that's exactly why we remember it, because the LS6 was the high water mark. The absolute peak of what American engineers could build when they weren't worried about emissions or fuel economy or liability lawyers. 450 horsepower, probably more, in a car you could buy at your local Chevy dealer. It was excessive, irresponsible, glorious, and doomed from the moment it was born. They don't make them like that anymore. They can't make them like that anymore. And maybe that's for the best. The air is cleaner now. Cars are safer. Fuel economy matters. The world that created the LS6 is gone, and on balance, the world that replaced it is probably better. But still, there's something about knowing that once upon a time, some engineers in Detroit decided to build the most powerful engine they could, put it in a mid-size sedan, and sell it to anyone with $4,000 and a death wish. No focus groups, no risk assessment meetings, just pure, distilled American horsepower. The Chevy 454 LS6, 450 horses, 2 years of production, and a legend that will outlive everyone who ever drove one. And that is the story of the most powerful engine of its era, and how the world changed around it before it ever had a chance to grow old. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments. Had you heard of the LS6 before today? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.